Are you able to share the video? Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. A very warm welcome to yet another session of Weekend with Wisdom. Let me begin with a small prayer. Sada Shiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Hari Om. Today we have a special guest joining us all the way from London, Sri Rajaram Venkataramani ji, and he'll be speaking on essential grammar to study Sanskrit texts. This is a document that he and his wife has prepared. It's called Abhinava Vaiyakarana, under the guidance of Sri Brahma Sri Mani Dravida Shastrigal, to simplify, to give an overview of the Sanskrit grammar in a very simplified format, so that it will help those seekers and scholars who are studying the direct source Sanskrit text. Before we move further, just a brief introduction to Sri Rajaramji. Sri Rajaram Venkataramani ji is a technocrat by profession, working and a hobby mathematician. He lives with his family in UK. He comes from a typical modern Tamil Brahmin family with one leg rooted in Smarta and Vaidika traditions. And he has a personal interest in Bhakti and Vedanta traditions and has learnt essentials of both Advaita Vedanta and Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. And he has also edited a thesis at SOAS on Gudhartha Deepika, which establishes Bhakti as Parama Purushartha within Advaita Vedanta. He's a student of Sanskrit with a keen interest in the structure of the language. Very warm welcome to you, sir. Thank you for coming to the program. So without further ado, please go ahead and start your session.
Thank you, Nitinji. Let me first share the screen. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. First of all, I wanted to set a further context to what Shri Nitinji said. In the pursuit of understanding the Shastras, the Bhakti and the Vedanta Shastras, I learned there was a big handicap, which is my lack of knowledge of the Sanskrit language. Even when I was, getting clarifications from Shastrigal, I found that, he had to translate from, Sanskrit to Tamil for me to understand. I think there's not much to say about English translations that are available there. So it's very important that we actually learn the Sanskrit language. When you start looking at learning the language, it's important to be able to speak, to be able to listen to Upanishadams, and also be able to write. And there are some good courses for basic spoken Sanskrit. And with some proficiency, one can, listen and, write as well. But it takes time. It takes a lot of effort, and it is not going to come by very easily. Actually speaking, the reading of the Sanskrit text is fairly easy. It's actually, something which we can enter into very, very quickly, because the structure of the Sanskrit language, unlike the other languages, is very well defined. So if you start reading, then we will get a better understanding of the structure of the language, and it will also build us our vocabulary, our ability to understand the language and how it's spoken, how it's written, etc. And most importantly, we will be able to enter into texts like, Ramayana, Mahabharata, etc. I should add a caveat. It is still required for us to go through a proper training in, texts like Siddhanta Kaumudi or Ashtadhyayi, either through, the Laghu Siddhanta Kaumudi route or Laghu Paniniya route, and progress in that. If you want to go into technical texts like Vedanta, right? When I was asking Shastri if it's the current knowledge I have is sufficient to read this text, he said it is not. Mainly because when you read texts like Shankara Bhashya, you will see that he is using certain, certain grammatical constructs. Unless you are familiar with the sutras, you will not be able to understand them. However, a lot of text can be understood with a clear understanding of the structure of the language and how to go about analyzing the text. We are also aided by the fact that we have advances in technology. Google has released its translate software. I think IIT Mumbai is also working on the Sanskrit translation software, etc. So this could potentially help Sanskrit enthusiasts to enter into the texts. In this effort, I have also been encouraged by my wife Mahalakshmi, and the text has been proofread by Shivatsa Brahma, who has spent quite some time translating and teaching Sanskrit. And the text is, the document is available online, and we'll be touching on all the key essential concepts of the Sanskrit grammar. And at the end of it, you should be able to go start, reading Sanskrit text. And if you're already reading, better grasp of how to go about analyzing. We have a lot of ground to cover, obviously. So the best way probably to do it is for me to go through this, and you can send your questions by chat. If I can answer them, I will answer them. If it's something I need to do some research, come back to you. I will do that offline, come back. So let's start with how to actually, understand the Sanskrit text, right? So this is the most important slide. If you really want to focus on one slide in this document, it is this slide. And what it really tells you is what are the structures, or what is the structure of the Sanskrit language like. Right? And you will come across all the key terms here, which will be used throughout your journey in the analysis of Sanskrit language. Like in any other language, Sanskrit sentences are made up of words, right? So we need to be able to go through words. What makes it difficult, from our perspective, is the fact that it's a highly declined language, meaning it has a lot of declensions. Right? So we need to be able to get a grasp of those declensions. I think once we understand how the words are declined and how to kind of get the root word or the original word from those declined forms, we'll be able to break the sentences down. So the first and foremost thing to learn in understanding a Sanskrit sentence is the ability to do padachedam. Right? For that, we need to have a clear grasp of sandhi. Now, if you go online and search for Abhinav Vyakarna and search, you'll probably find 40 lectures by Shastrigal on the Sandhi Prakara. It's gone into different aspects of Sandhi, right? So it will be very useful for us to grasp. It's in, simple Sanskrit, spoken in a Sanskrit presentation. It's in Sanskrit, but it's in a simple presentation. So it will be very useful to go through that. What we will be touching here is all the essential aspects of Sandhi that we should know to be able to do padachedam, right? And we will get padams, that is the word. Now, the words themselves have three types primarily, right? One is avaya or indeclinable words. These are words which don't undergo declension, or they have a pre-declined, declined form, right? So if you don't understand what is declension at this point, you'll get it as you go through this, course in the next 90 minutes or so. Then you have Subantam, which can be roughly translated into nouns. But essentially, these are words which have Sup as the Antam. Sup is essentially a set of letters, and words that end with those letters is called Subantam. Then you have Tigantam, which is a set of words. Tin is a set of words, letters, and words that end with that set of letters or the declined form is called Tigantam. So this is roughly translated as verb by us. Right? Now, the next thing you need to understand is the chandas. Right? Chandas is actually a little bit more complicated than what I have represented here. Chandas has got a particular connotation in the Vedic Sanskrit and a particular connotation in the classical Sanskrit. But what I'm kind of really focusing on is the fact that the Vedic Sanskrit, there is tonality, right? So there is swara attached to the letters, whereas in the Laukika you will hardly ever find that. So most of the texts that we deal with are Laukika texts, and these do not have, you do not really need to know the rules of chandas to be able to enter into that in detail, right? Whereas in the Vedic you probably do. But from our perspective, what we need to know for the words is, what is the Purusha? Like, there are different persons, right? It's a first person, second person, third person, etc. that we have in English, right? So it's similar to that. Then in Sanskrit, like in some of the Indian languages, there is lingam, that is the words have gender. So you need to know what gender that language, that word is in, right? Whether it is a masculine or Purusha, the feminine Stri or, neutral, Napumsaka. Then the lingam, and the words also have the Subantam, that is the nouns, which essentially could be subject, objects, places, things, and also some adjectives that could be formed, have what's called as karakam, right? So the karakam is easily understood first as a vibhakti, right? Vibhakti is essentially the case. So in English, we have nominative, accusative, and all these cases. So Sanskrit has something similar to that. But these cases are also linked to what's called as karakam. So we'll talk about it. Karakam is essentially, a description of how these cases refer to something which is happening to that verb, right? For example, something comes from something, then you would say it's a fifth case, but then that is also a type of a karakam. So what I have done in this document is to map the cases to karakam. So it's easy to understand cases and then, map it to karakam. Then, you go to lakara. Lakara is essentially tenses and moods. Compared to other languages, Sanskrit has got fewer tenses. So it's relatively simpler compared to, other languages. You will see that when you go into, the lakara section. Right? Then you have vachana, right? So it's like singular, singular, plural, and dual, right? Many languages, like many Indo-European languages have three, vachanas, or is the cardinality. So in the thing, so Sanskrit has that. Right? So probably they picked up from Sanskrit, so we don't know. So that's probably one of the reasons why they have it. Then you have what you call as samasa, right? This is a very important concept in Sanskrit, right? Where you have the words combined to form different compound words, and they can be compounded to form very, very large compounds. And it brings in a lot of efficiency in how you can communicate. And this is one reason why it might seem quite difficult for us to understand. But once we understand the types of samasas that we have, then we will be able to basically read back and understand what we are really talking about. Right? The other aspect is there are pratyas or suffixes, right, that are attached to the words, and these pratyas add certain special meaning to it. So we'll be talking about some types of pratyas, and how they actually change the meaning of the words. Then you have upasargas, like to say prefixes that are attached to the words, and these prefixes, will also change the meaning of the word. Right? Now, what happens with Sanskrit is all these words, right? can arguably, I'll say why arguably shortly, can be all derived from the dhatus, right? So one theory is that every word can be derived from, roughly around 2000 odd dhatus or roots. And you can then form, more complex, prakritis, like basically pratipadika shabdas, and they can be used to construct nouns, right? Then the other theory is that, it will be stretched to do that. Only it's possible to, I think there are a set of dhatus. Most of the verbs do come from all the verbs do come from the dhatus, but, the nouns, they do come from certain, prakriti words or pratipadika shabda, right? So from our perspective, from a purpose of reading that Sanskrit text, it's not required to take a position on either side. What we really need to know is what is the pratipadika, common pratipadika sabdams, right? Like Rama Shabdam and all that, and what are the common dhatus, and how we can actually, undecipher. Basically, unwrap those things and decipher what they are. Right? So the algorithm for studying a Sanskrit text is first to do padachakam, come up with a list of words. Once you have done this, actually pretty much we can cover any text today, right? To break it into. So if we understand the next section, which is the Sandhi section, it will actually be sufficient for us to go into, a translate software and enter this in, and, make sure that you are picking up the right word for that, right meaning for that word, and you'll be able to translate and make sense of this text. But of course, we'll go beyond that, right? So what we really need to do is to also understand what is the karakam, what is the lingam, what is the purusha, what is the lakara, etc., so that we are able to form a better understanding of these words and learn the types of samasas, so that we can actually, go deeper into the meaning of this. Okay, so am I clear? Is it all understandable so far? If you can just say yes or no, or thing, or you can also shoot any questions if you have on the chat. Okay, so Nitinji, do we normally make this interactive, or is it generally?
Usually, speakers take questions at the end. That would be better.
Okay.
Last 10 minutes, you can. I'll ask you the questions. I'll choose the questions from the chat box, and then you can take it.
Sure. No worries. So far, I think I'll assume that it's all clear. If anything is not clear, please ask the question. Yeah. We now go to the next section. Like I said, Sandhi section is very, very important. And we will talk about how, the words are conjuncted in Sanskrit. Right? One easy part of Sanskrit grammar is there are close to about 4,500 rules, or sutras in Panini's Ashtadhyayi, and like there are 4,000 there. Then there are Unadi sutras, so they together make up around 4,500 also, right? But the easy part is that these rules operate on letters. Right? Every rule that you have in Sanskrit language operates on a letter. Right? So that's the case with Sandhi also. All the conjunctions are not random. They are all very, very formal, very, very structured, and actually very scientific. They come from the principle of ease when you actually speak. When you actually this thing, right? So when we look at the Sandhi, then we understand why these words are conjuncted in that particular way, and it makes a lot more sense. I'll try to share a little of my understanding of this, in the next few things. So how is when you read when we read the text, right? We have to go in the reverse order. Right? The words are already conjuncted; they are in the joint up form, and we have to do padachak. But for you to be able to do that, we need to, go in the forward direction, which is to understand how the words came together in the first place, right? So that we can unwrap them. So there are essentially three processes. My apologies for the numbering not being correct. I'll correct it in the document, right? So the first process is adesha, right? So in this one, you have a letter, and this letter will be replaced by a new letter, a group of letters. Right? Let's take, for example, yadi plus api. In yadi, the last letter is E. Then you add an A to it. And the rule is that the E replaces E. So it becomes yadyapi. So once we know that this is how this replacement happens, you can understand that yadyapi is made up of two words, yadi and api. Then you can look up what it means and make sense out of that. The second process is agama. In this one, a letter arises among existing letters. Like, for example, kurban aste. Here what happens is you have an extra in because you have kurban naste. When you try to say that, you will naturally see that you are stressing this. Of course, there are sutras behind that, but the sutras come from common sense, right? And the basic structure of the language. So you say this, okay, kurban naste. So you have one letter getting added to the combination of letters. So when we read the text, when we see kurban naste, we need to be able to break it down into kurban plus naste. Right? How do you know that you have successfully broken it down? That is based by actually making sure that you are coming up with a correct, valid word in the dictionary. Previously, we should actually be further able to remove the declension to be able to look up in the dictionary. But now with Google Translate and other softwares that are coming up, even if you have not broken it down completely, you'll be able to make sense of that word. So Sandhi becomes the most important concept to learn for us to start entering into the text to start with. Then comes lopa. In this one, a letter is removed. For example, Arjuna Uvacha. There's a visarga, Arjuna. And when we say this together with Uvacha, that aha gets dropped. That's called lopa. It's elision. Right? So you say Arjuna Uvacha. So if you see, it's very natural for, especially the Bharatiya people, because, many of the languages have this, but it's also natural for people of other languages. In all languages, it's kind of more linked to the human biology and the way, our, mind processes words and letters, right? So we try to look for simplicity, and Sanskrit rules provide that natural simplicity. So Arjuna Uvacha becomes Arjuna Uvacha. So these are the only three processes in Sandhi. There are not many others, right? So this gives you, different types of combinations of letters. Now, there are again three types of combinations of letters, right? So for just like in other languages, you have vowels and consonants. So vowels are swaras, and vowels are consonants. Swarasanti is how two letters come together and form a new letter. Basically, two vowels come together and form a new letter. For example, Gana plus Isha becomes Ganesha. Here, A and E combine to form A. So there are rules for that. So once we learn, this pattern, then we'll be able to break this down. So when you say Ganesha, then you can now break it down and make sense of it. In some cases, it's enough to know the combined form for us to read and translate. Only when it's joined up too much, then we need to break it down, right? We are reading it. Then, when you say Vyanjana Sandhi, it's the change of the consonants, right? For example, Vak plus Isha becomes Vagisha. Here you can say Vakisha seems very stressed. So you will see often that, that stress from ik becomes ig, right? But in the same sthana, right? It is in the same guttural sound. Ik and ig are both guttural, and Vak plus Isha becomes Vagisha. Right? So you'll see this pattern of changes, right? It's simplification, conscious simplification. There are a lot of, nuances, and exceptions. But what's really important is to understand the overall pattern so that we can, handle the exceptions as they occur, right? And, the good part about reading and like listening or speaking is that you are going to do it in the comfort of your study. You're going to sit down the text and you're going to break it down, analyze it slowly. So there's no time pressure of responding quickly. when you have to do in the case of speaking, or what you have to do in the case of listening. Here, you can spend the time you need to understand and break the words down. Right? That's the reason why reading is very, very important. Apart from the fact that we enter into texts like Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavatam, Kalidasa, and all that. The third is Visarga Sandhi. We saw about Visarga in the previous slide. Here, you're talking about a change to the Visarga. So we saw one type of change, which is the lopa or elision. And the other, there are a couple of others I'm kind of calling out here. One is like Ramaha plus cha becomes Ramascha. Right? So here you can see that there's a new letter arising in the combination. So again, you can see that, this sibilant arises when you actually say. So when you say Ramacha, right? So naturally, that Ramascha has got a much natural straight, right? Otherwise, it will change the cha also, right? If you say Ramacha, it becomes the cha, right? Whereas Ramascha will retain the cha in its pristine form and only impact the visarga here, right? So the rules of grammar are formed based on that common sense. Okay. Now you have bala atra, then you have lopa. Lopa is a very common occurrence in the case of sandhi, right? So in the case of visarga sandhi, so you see that it is getting elated. So you say bala atra. So bala atra, then there is one more combination, swara sandhi, which might get added, which will make it into bala atra, which I'm not showing here for simplicity. So you will say bala atra, you know that you can split it into bala atra, and you know that that tra is not a separate word, but actually there's an a there, because a plus a becomes a, and you got bala atra, right? So and then you know that bala is pratipadika, is from the pratipadika bala, and here there must have been a visarga for it to become a padam, right? Like, one of the things is pratipadikam and dhatus are not padams; they are the raw material which help you form the padam. Right? So if you have been this thing with me so far, if you already know this, or if you understand this, pretty much you will be able to take any Sanskrit text in loka, right? And you'll be able to break it down into words, parse it, come up with a word list, and look up and try to make sense of the text. Okay. But then you need to understand some more details of it. So there are a few examples, wanted to give from, Valmiki Ramayana. That's why Vara in that, right? So you have Savarna Dirgha Sandhi, right? So there are some variations of this, right, of Sandhi, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But, like Swa plus Adhyaya become Swadhyaya, right? So here and at the end of Swa and in the beginning of Adhyaya becomes a, right? So you end up with Swadhyaya. Then you have Gunasandhi, right, which is another type of Swarasanti. In this one, Deva Maya Iva. Here, A and E combine to form A, right? This is a pattern we saw already. So it's a variation of that pattern. Right? So you have Deva Maya Eva. So you are able to see that, how these combine. So this way these words combine. When you say Deva Maya Eva, then you'll be able to go back and undo, unwrap. The core of reading any Sanskrit text is to break these things down. Then Vriddhi Sandhi, again you will see this often. So Cha plus Eka becomes Chaika. So here A and A combine to form I. So there are different variations of the Swara-sandhi. We'll go into it in the next slide, but these are common patterns, right? So I think once we get this, we can break it down. Then if you look at Vyanjana Sandhi, so just form, right? Here what happens is Etat plus Ichami, right? Etat Ichami. Here what is going on is, like we saw in the previous example of Vak plus Isha, Vagisha, you see that Etat Ichami, here, it becomes it at the end of Etat becomes it, right? You get Etat Ichami. So when you see in the original text, you have either, if you once you know this rule, you'll be able to understand that this D here is actually an it. Right? So this is the working out that we have to really do. And then you come up with your Padachedam is successful when you are able to come up with the right meaningful word that you can look up in the dictionary or on a translate software. Then you get Visargasandhi. Right? In this one, you have Visargareba. Right? Now, we did see the rising of new letters in the presence of the existing letters. Right? So Visargareba is one of those cases. So you have Sadhuhu plus Adinatma. So you have the Repa. Repa is nothing but R sound. So Sadhur Adinatma. So you have this Repa rising here. Right? So then you see Visargasya Obhava. No, what does that mean? It becomes like Visarga becomes O. Right? The Visarga changes into a new letter. We saw that another thing that happens is change of letters from one to another. We saw some examples of that. That's a common example. So Ramaha plus Nama becomes Ramo Nama. Like here Aha becomes O. Right? So when you see the original text, you say Ramo Nama. You see that Ramo does not have meaning. Then we know that O would have arisen out of the Visarga. Right? Then you kind of drop the O and add in a Visarga. Right? Of course, we do have to get into the rules, the sutras, and internalize them for us to apply them, meticulously, correctly, and all that. And this process will give erroneous outcomes sometimes because we won't know the exceptions. But by and large, we'll be able to get, and we have a way to check it because we can actually go back and see if you're coming up with the right padam. Right? Meaningful padam is essentially a meaningful word. Right? Then Visargasya Sakara. Now you have Kaha plus Cha becomes Kascha. So we saw Ramascha. So it's similar to that. So you have Kascha. So you will see these in the text. Now, if you take Valmiki Ramayana, it is fairly a simple one text, and you have all these cases occurring. There are translations available, and there are also some scholars and students who have done analysis of Valmiki Ramayana and put it up online. So you will be able to compare your analysis with what's been done by others. Of course, Sanskritam is a language which has to be learned from a guru. Vyakaranam is a shastram which has to be learned from a guru. Right? So all the self-study would help you to kind of make good use of the time you spend with your guru, who is a vidwan in Sanskrit. Right? So you need to this thing, right? Familiarize yourself, and also it will actually maximize what you get out of it because you progress very quickly in understanding this. Okay, I did say that it is fairly straightforward, but it has got a lot of classifications, and once again, we don't need to get intimidated or by the number of classifications. Right? It's not great to know all of them to start breaking the words down. Right? So you can start with the simple, 3 classifications, right, of Swarasanti, Vyanjana and Visargasandhi, and then go back and start breaking the words down. Okay, but you do have, Shutvasandhi. We saw some examples of that, where ish occurs, right? Then Anunasika, and then you have Shutvasandhi, right? So you have Jashva Sandhi, Anunasika Sandhi, etc. Right? These are where the words are formed based on different types. Right? So this document is available. In terms of looking at it, you can start seeing this. Types of sandhis. Examples of this. Online, or you can look at, right? But I would just like to call one of these things. For example, in Swarasanti, you have Yen Sandhi, right? Yen is essentially a set of letters that start with Ya and end with Yin in the Maheshwarani Sutrani, right? So, and the Sandhi that arises out of that set is the Yen Sandhi. And what are the rules for that? is what we need to see. Like we saw some of the Savarna Dirgha Sandhi, Guna Sandhi, etc. And we also saw Vriddhi Sandhi, right? So we have seen some of the Visargasya Lopa, Visargasya, Repo Deshaha, etc. Right? So you kind of, once we start reading the text and then start trying to map, which type of Sandhi it is, we'll become familiar with that type of Sandhi. But what's really important is in Sandhi rules, understand that there are three major classifications of Sandhi that arise through three processes of elision, change, and creation of letters. And like in Srishti Sthiti and this thing, right? So it's like that, right? And break it down. And as long as you're able to break it into meaningful padam, then you could tend the Padachidam, right? Okay. So now we got to padam, right? Let's now look at what is padam, because words, what are the meaningful components of this, right? So we'll talk about that now. So basically, we don't need to worry about tonality in most of the text, right? So of course, chandas is not just tones. It's about grouping of the words and the matter that comes to it. That's the real meaning. But when we look at the words, we don't need to worry too much about the tone in the loka. Right? Basically, we need to, like we saw in the previous one, we have three types of words, right? The avaya or the indeclinable, right? These are words that don't change form based on, purusha, lakara, or karaka. They don't, right? They remain same, right? By this you would have understood that there are words which change. In fact, all the words change based on the tense and case, but avaya words don't change. Knowing the avaya words is useful because you can straight away understand the meaning of that part of the sentence. Then you have tigantam, which are the verbs, like action words, and then subantam, right, which are the nouns and adjectives, right? Basically, these are words which are identified based on how they end, right? What are the letters in which they end? Once you know that this is a verb, this is a noun, and so on, and then we'll be able to, once we understand the declension rules, we'll be able to undecline them and come up with the, base form of the verb and the base form of the noun and know which case it is in and so on. Let's start with the avaya. Okay. So you have 9 types of avaya. Again, it's not required for us to know all of this, remember all of this, to start reading the text. What we really need to know is that there are different types, and when you come across them, you will be able to go back and relate to that. That's the key thing. So there are some samasas which are in the avaya bhava. Right? We'll also see this in the samasa session briefly, right? So, for example, adi vriksham, right? First tree, then madhye margam, upanagaram, etc. So these are words which have been combined and they tend to occur in that form repeatedly. Right? So that is something we need to learn. Then kriya viseshan, right? So amishmin is a word which occurs in that form. Then subanta pratirupa. Here you have astam, namaha. We always use that word namaha, and it keeps appearing, right, again and again. Then swasti, right? Swaha, when we are all familiar with that. Sham and these kind of sabda. Then tigantarupam. Like most of the Sanskrit is a very active language, and there's an argument that every Sanskrit sentence has got an explicit or an implicit verb. Debatable, but it's true for at least most of the sentences, right? Even when there is no explicit verb, you have it implicitly there. Like asti, it means it exists, and that is implicitly there if there is no explicit sentence. Or nasti could be there, right, which means it does not exist, and so on, right? Then asmi, aha, asa, etc. So we see that some of these words do not change form, based on the other parts of the sentence. right? So they retain their structure. So once you know them, you can actually use them in that form. Then you have the taditanta. Tadita is a set of pratyaya suffixes, right? And these suffixes, get added to the words, and they form some meaning, right? Say, for example, matu. Then you have matrutaha from mother, pitrutaha, aditaha from aditya, and so on, right? Then madhyataha, swarataha, etc. Then we always say like that and all. So tadvat, right? So you have the vat antani, right? Basically, it's a tadita antam, but it's had a vat added to that, right? Then you have shasantam, right? So we did see the occurrence of shas in some cases, but this is an indeclinable, how the letter shaha gets added to this, like alpashaha, bahushaha, right? Kantashaha, and so on. So you have that shaha gets added, and these are indeclinable words. So when you see these words, then you know that these are aveya padas, and once you familiarize with them in the text, most authors tend to reuse a set of words that they like, and it actually tends to repeat. So you kind of understand how to make sense of that without having to look up the dictionary. Then you have kridanta, right? So you have kritva, gatva, drishtva, etc. Right? So here you have the katvant, right? Basically, where you have the you kind of have the krit, that kind of it sound is getting added, right? So to that original word, to say that having finished this, I went and did something, right? So in English, we call it as gerund, right? It's similar to that, right? Then labanta, right? So here, it's the word like, yeah, right? So Sanskrit, yeah, right? Sandrishya, etc. So here we are seeing that addition of ya sound. That ya sound is to kind of qualify this, right? So which again is the same meaning as having done, etc. But here, the word is changed by adding of ya sound to this. Then tumanat, right? Here, gantum ichami, right? I wish to go, right? So it's an indication of something you want to do, like kartum, drashtum, etc. So you have the tum sound added. Then that gantum is an aveyapadam, and it tends to occur in that form in the sentence without undergoing changes. And then the sankhya vyayani is numerals, right? So dvihi, trihi, chatuhu, panchakritva, etc. So these tend to be numeral constructions, and they all are formed based on some underlying Paninian rules, which we have to eventually learn. But from a purpose of reading, the initial text, we do not need to understand the underlying rules. We need to know that these numerals are formed, numeral words are formed, and this is the structure in which they occur. And when we read through a text like Ramayana, we start familiarizing ourselves with it. Right? Then Kala Vachakani Avyani. So Adya, right? So like today, Adyatve, Usha, like Shwaha, tomorrow, and so on. Right? So you can, again, these are like words which repeatedly occur, right? Without changing form, right? I'm not going so much into the meaning, right? I'm more interested in talking about the structure of the language, because the meaning is something you always look at. What's really important is to understand the structure of the language. And once you understand the structure of the language, you'll be able to break the sentence down and understand what's going on. Right? Then you have, Anyani Kanichitavyani, which is essentially miscellaneous types, right? So you have Akasma, Tata, and all that. So here, what we are seeing is, there are certain, words like this, like Atha, right, which tends to appear, right? And it's got its own, meanings and interpretations, but essentially these are words which do not decline in the sentence. And so they are not affected by the linga, which is the gender. They're not affected by vibhakti, which is the case. They're not affected by vachanam, cardinality, and they tend to be in that original form across different types of sentences. So knowing this gets you a head start in breaking the sentence down. Like I said, the Sanskrit is active language in the sense that verb is present in most of the languages and it is implicit in words and in sentences which don't have a verb. So the tigantam is very, very important. In fact, when we read a sentence, what we really look for is what is the verb of this particular sentence, and then we anchor everything around the verb. We don't actually anchor it on avaya, right? Because that becomes fairly obvious to us. It is the verb on which we have to anchor. So when you read a sentence, you need to see if there's an explicit verb or if there's an implicit verb, right? And obviously, many of the verbs come in a decline form. So we need to understand what those declensions are. Right? I'll take a pause here. There are a few, I think there are, this thing, right? I'll let you kind of digest what's been.
Do you want to take questions now, Rajaram?
I think, let's see if there's in the online.
There are many questions, but you can speak for another 30 minutes and then last 15 minutes we'll take up questions.
Yeah, I'm just seeing if there's any blocker that will stop people from progressing.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so yeah, I think none of these are blockers. Like I said, see, broadly the questions seem to be around, okay, it's difficult to follow, right? Because they don't know the grammar of some other language. Actually, you don't need to know the grammar of some other language, right? If you understood the first slide, which talks about the structure of the Sanskrit sentence, you will be able to understand the grammar of other languages with reference to Sanskrit. Right? Then there are questions around the meaning of gatva, gatya, nirgatya, etc. I think those meanings are not what you should be focusing on for this one. Right? What we really need to focus on is the structure of the language, right? And that's a lot to gain by understanding the structure of the language, right? I will answer all the other questions if time permits at the end or in a separate, email or whatever. Okay. Especially because someone has said that it was difficult to follow because of his or her lack of background of the Sanskrit language. I mean, of background grammar of any other language. Let me again repeat it in a fairly simple way. Right? So you have a Sanskrit sentence that you want to read, and that sentence is made up of words, and these words are of three types basically. It could be avaya, it could be tigantam, and it could be subantam. Right? So avaya are essentially indeclinable words. Tigantam is verbs. We are going to talk about it more. And then you have subantam, which are essentially nouns. Words which talk about name, place, things, etc. Right? So we have to understand what type of word it is. And then these words decline. Decline is essentially change in the shape of the word, the form of the word, based on different factors, such as Purusha. Purusha means whether it's a first person. First person means, I do something, and then second person. It's got a change between Sanskrit and other languages. So Purusha means, whether you are talking about yourself, somebody else, or a third person, it's true. Then cardinality, whether it's a singular, right, plural, or a dual. And case, right, whether you're talking about accusative, nominative, it's true. Right? Now, if you do not know these grammar, grammatical usage of Purusha, Vachanam, etc., I don't think you need to worry about it. Right? If you understood the process of Sandhi and you can break it down, you will be able to understand what these mean as you go through the subsequent sessions. Of course, if you had knowledge of cardinality, etc., from others, you should be able to follow much more easily. With that, let me progress into the Tigantam, right? Okay, so there are 6 tenses and 4 modes in Sanskrit, right? So let's talk about the tenses first. Right? So tenses are essentially, words which talk about, okay, whether you are in the present tense, past tense, or future tense, right? Whether talking about something which is happening now, something which happened in the past, whether we're talking about something which is going to happen in the future, right? In Sanskrit, there are only 6 tenses. It's actually simpler than, other modern languages where you have more breakup, right, of tenses, right? So the first one is what they call as, lit, lit, right? Lit is essentially the technical term for it. What it really means is it's a Parokshya Bhuta. That is, it is something which is past perfect. Past perfect means it is done, it happened in the past, right? It's clear, right? Something in the something that happened way back, right? So babuva is an example for that. Then you have lung, right? This is Buddha. This is what we call in English as aorist past, right? So this is what you might call as something which happened in the past, but it might have certain effect now and so on, right? But it's got an end. It's not that something it happened long back. It's something which happened in the past. It's got an end, right? So abut is an example of that. So it happened, it ended there. Then you have lung, right? This is anadyatana abut, right? This is past imperfect, right? This is what you would say is, it could be a continuous this thing, right? I had been going to this place. I have been doing this, etc. Right? Those kind of ambiguous things which have not happened in the long distance path or in the short distance path, but happened, but it may be continuing today, right? As you speak, or it may have just about ended, right? So those kind of words are called this thing, like abhavat. It happened, but it's something which is this thing, right? So he has been, it has been happening, right? So in English, you'll have to use different words to this thing, or else it's actually more complex. Whereas in Sanskrit, it's abhavat. So it actually is fairly simple. So it kind of goes from past perfect to past to the imperfect. Then in present, there's only one, right? In English, you have the present perfect, present continuous, and so on. You don't have that kind of complexities, right? But you still communicate the same meaning, right? Contextually, right? So let is Vartamana Kala, and Bhavati is an example for that. Right? Then you have Lut, right? Which is like future imperfect, right? So which is like something which is going to happen, will be happening, those kind of things, right? So something which is going to come up, right? Tomorrow, day after, and so on, is anadyatana bhavishyat, right? So here, bhavita is an example of that. Then something which is perfectly into the future, right? With no connection to the present is called, bhavishyat kala, and that is the term for this is lut, right? So bhavishyati is an example of that. So basically, these are the 6 tenses, like lit, lung, lung, lat, lut, and lit. Okay? You're not going to, if you're not exposed to this before, don't feel this thing. You're not going to be having to remember all of this right away, right? All you need to know is in this one that Sanskrit sentences, the verbs go from the past to the future, right? And based on the tense, lakara, it undergoes change, right? See, for example, the word, right? It has, it has kind of become bhavati, right? And then abhavat, right? Abhut, babuva, all of these come from the same thought, right? Bhavita, bhavishyati, etc. So you see that this is how the words will change this thing. Meaning, now you don't need to unwrap these words and go back to the dhatu. It is not required to understand the meaning in many cases, right? Because in most sentences, you go with the rudyartham or conventional meaning, and the conventional meanings are anyway given in the dictionary for you and the translation software. So you'll be able to pick up the conventional meaning. If you type into bhavishyati, it will tell you what it is, right? So you can pretty much, read a sentence, type it in and understand it. But the reason you do this and understand the structure is to know that this is why this particular word means this. This is what they are really meaning. And sometimes the translation software and might make mistakes. Dictionaries don't, but translation software do make mistakes. And you'll be able to spot when you understand the structure, right? So in the lakara, this is the main thing. Then you have the moods, So like, what are the modes? Like, so one is agya. Agya is a command, right? So you ask somebody to do something, right? So that is called lot, right? So you give a command, and the same dhatu now yes becomes bhavatu, right? Then if you see the other thing, it's like vidhi, right? So vidhi is a rule, right, or potential. So you say, okay, I mean, there's a potential for something to happen, right? And or a condition. I mean, it's a condition. It's actually, it's more of potential, right, for something to happen. And what is the consequence of that? When you want to say that, that is where you use the vidhi link. Then, when you want to give benediction, that is blessing and that kind of thing, you use the ashali, right? So here you use the same word becomes boyat, right? So that is another mood in which a word changes. Again, based on the lakara, the word undergoes that change. Then you have the lut, right? Here it is a condition, right? For example, abhavishyat, if it happens, right? Is a condition in which you are forming a sentence. So when we see sentences with words, you will be able to identify that these are nouns, verbs, because they are tigantam. As you can see, they are ending with it sound. So it's the, ta, the, and all those. And somehow they decline, into babu, etc. Right? So they change form, right? So I think we'll be able to link it back to whether it is a verb, and if it's a verb, in which lakara it is occurring. So the biggest exercise that we have to train our mind to is, when we read the sentences, be able to identify what lakara that particular, what's the verb there and what lakara it is in, right? Then it will give us that understanding of the sentence, and everything else is based on the verb, and based on the verb you link it back to the rest of the text. So then you have classification of the verb roots. So this classification is important because the verbs change form based on the classification. So for example, you have atmanepadam, parasmaipadam, and ubayapadam. So what is atmanepadam? Atmanepadam is one which has got benefit for oneself, right? So when you do vandate, is like, here the beneficiary is, even though you may be doing namaskaram to somebody else or worship of somebody else, like Ishvara, the benefit comes back to you. It's for you. So that is atmanepadam. So when it is in that atmanepadam, that kind of roots will always decline in that form, right? It will become vandate, etc. So when you see, typically it is in that form, you know that it is actually an atmanepadam. So you know the meaning, the sense in which the author is using that particular word. Then you have parasmaipadam. Here, it is, the beneficiary is somebody else. In Gachati, it's gone. So you're going from one place to another, it's done. So you're not getting anything back from doing that. It's an act you complete and you're gone, right? So here, the beneficiary is somebody else, right? And some of the roots decline in that parasmaipadam form only. Then there are ubaya, where you have both kinds of beneficiaries. You have pachati and pachate. So the same dhatu here declines into and takes two different forms, pachati and pachate, right? So whenever it ends with the te, vidyate, etc., vandate, etc., it's atmanepadam. Whenever it ends with the ti, etc., it ends in it's kind of a parasmaipadam. And you know that some of the words could end in both forms. And if they end in both forms, then you know that it is being used in that particular sense by the author. And so it gives an understanding of the sense of the usage. And of course, once you break it down into words, you will be able to look up what the meaning is and go from there. The other way it is, so the verbs decline is based on Purusha. So in Prathama Purusha, right, it's the first person. In English and other languages, Prathama Purusha is yourself. The first person is yourself, right? In Sanskrit, I think probably it's the Samskriti, the culture. The other this thing is put as the first person. What is called as third person in English is put as a first person. So you have Ramaha Vandate. So you can see that Ramaha is Vandate is in the Prathama Purusha form, and you have Vandate in that in the Atmanepada type, right? So that's a structure in which you do. Then you have Ramaha Gacchati. Here again, you have Ramaha, then Gacchati is, in the Parasmapadam form. So it's Prathama Purusha and Parasmapadam. Right? Then you have Ramaha Pachati and Ramaha Pachate. So you have in the Prathama Purusha form, but you also have Ubhayapadam. So you have Pachati is Atmanepada, is Parasmapadam, and Pachate is Atmanepadam. Then you have Madhyama Purusha, right? Which is like where you are addressing somebody. Tvam Gachasi, like you go, etc. So here, you are addressing somebody, the thing, so Gachati here now becomes Gachasi. So what we need to know when we read the sentences is to know that if it ends with a C, and if these are like some of the verbs, then this is a verb word, right? So you have to identify this is Tigantapadam. So Tigantam Tin Pratyaya is ends with the, right? Here it changes into is by certain rules, and we need to understand that these are the forms it will take. And there are only finite number of forms. They don't take too many forms. Actually, we can figure out what is a verb by looking at the word endings. Then you have Pam Vandasi, Pam Pachasi, right? So by looking at this, you will be able to say that, oh, this is actually in Madhyama Purusha, right? Whereas this is in the Prathama Purusha. Then Uttama Purusha, right, is first person. And it's a reference to your own self. And here, Aham Mande, Aham Gachami, Aham Pachami, Aham Pache. If you really look at it here, that ending with me, etc., shows that, this is actually a, as a Uttama Purusha. So how do we familiarize ourselves with this? As we read this, I look at some of these words, and each word, we need to consciously think about whether it is in Prathama Purusha, Madhyama Purusha, Uttama Purusha, whether it is in Atmanepadam, Parasmapadam, or Ubhayapadam. Right? As we go through more and more exercises, we get familiar with the usages in that particular form. Okay. So you have certain 10 types of grouping of the dhatus. Right? Sanskrit words, as I said before, arguably all come from dhatus, and there are around 2000 dhatus. Right? And these dhatu groups, ganas, are grouped as into 10, and you have the vadigana, adhadigana, juhotyadigana, divadigana, swadigana, tudadigana, etc. So why do we need to know this? It is because each group of dhatus change in a particular way. For example, if you take bhu dhatu, it's got some pratyaya, which is suffix, as we saw. It's called vikarana pratyaya, which is something which comes and changes, right? In Sanskrit, all the rules apply on letters, right? So the bhu dhatu combines with a, right? And that's the pratyaya which changes. Then you end up with, the Purusha pratyaya, which is like Parasmapadam, based on Parasmapadam or Atmanepadam, it got a change. For example, the bhu dhatu, it appears in the Parasmapadam, right? It doesn't appear in the Atmanepadam. So you have bhavati, right? Then you have Vanda dhatu, right? It's got it kind of has as the vikarana pratyaya, but it ends into the Atmanepadam. So you end up with Vandate, right? Then you have Ad dhatu. It's got it's automatically, it doesn't have any vikarana pratyaya, but it gets, it appears in the Parasmaya form by addition of ti, and then it becomes ati, right? So you can see that a reversal of that form, right? We saw how hard letter becomes softer, and here in the softer one becomes harder, right? At plus ti becomes ati, right? Then you have as plus te, it becomes aste, right? Here you can see that a becomes a, that change happens. This is where, these changes are quite involved, and there are a number of rules to know about it, right? We'll see how we deal with it. Then you have who and the ti, right? You have juhoti, right? Now, based on what's going on, who becomes o here, right? So the letters change, and you see certain patterns here. So when you say juhoti, actually, you know that you can break it down to juhu. Then you have ha and te, you have jiti. Right? Now, if you can take a moment to read through this text is available, right? So what is that we need to really know about it? We need to know that the words will occur in these forms, right? You'll have, sunoti, sunute, divyati, divyate, etc. And if you can, I know there are a lot of people, so it's difficult to ask questions, but you can kind of go through that and see that you'll be able to break it down into, Uttama Purusha, Madhyama Purusha, etc. And you also will be able to break it down into Atmanepadam and Parasmepadam by looking at it. So the idea is that, we have, different dhatu forms, and these dhatu forms undergo changes, and we start understanding how these changes have happened. For example, chorayati, it's obviously different from normal changes. So you kind of, that it's coming from the churadi group of dhatus, and it can come in both the states, chorayati and choryate, right? Choryate. So you can kind of see that form. So once we identify the verbs, we do some exercise to go back and look at which form or structure it comes to. It's sufficient. Now, we don't need to identify the dhatus in most cases for our reading purposes and translation purposes, because the conventional meaning is what we use. But it's important to know that these exist, and that's why they are coming up in a particular form. Otherwise, we may think it's a wrong construction, and it is probably not. Then you have the change based on lakara, right? Now you say karoti, right? Then, based on the this thing, it could becomes based on the vachanam, it could be kurutaha, kurvanti, etc. Right? And the same dhatu in the Atmanepadam becomes kurute, kurvate, kurvate, etc. Right? So we get familiar with these forms. Then in Madhyama Purusha, you have these different structures, and then you have similar structures in the Uttama Purusha. Right? So you kind of go through some of these, and that they can change based on the vachanam, ekavachanam, dvivachanam, bahuvachanam, etc. And who the beneficiary is, Atmanepadam, Parasmepadam, and so on. Okay. Then you have voices, right, which is the Prayoga Nirupana, right? So in voices, it is essentially active, passive, and impersonal, right? Active versus where, there's a subject and it does some action, right? So pushpam vikasati, right? So it's an active thing. Then pushpena vikasati, it's like by flower, right? So when we see the subandham, we understand what is case. Here it is the instrumental case. When it occurs in that, it's a bhava, form, right? And then it's akarmaka. Like here, there is no action, right? Of by the subject. It just does, it blossoms, flower blossoms. It's not doing something to somebody. Sakarmakaha is with an object, right? You have an object, like Gopalaha, Gam, Rakshat. So here, Gam is the object. So there is an object which the person Gopalaha is protecting. Right? And this can also be in a passive voice, like Gopalena, Goha, Rakshati. So you can see that Rakshati is now seen as Rakshate. So, it's in that, the change of form, but it's also because it's a passive form. Right? Then you have three karma. You have two objects like Shishya, Guru, Samshayam, Prichati. Like, from Guru, he's asking for doubt to be clarified. Right? So based on that, it is actually changing this form. Right? Once again, the active form, passive voice, we need to know it exists, and we need to be able to, go back and read this and, break it down and familiarize ourselves with how what type of voice it is, make those inferences and go from there. Okay. Once we get this, we have done what is Sandeep Prakaran, breaking up of the words. We got the words and we have identified what's the verb, and we are able to now classify the verbs based on the Purusha, Vachanam, etc. Like we saw in the first slide, right? And with that, we are now able to start making sense out of the verb. Right? Obviously, if there's a verb, there's going to be an object, a subject, right? And that is indicated by Subandham. Right? So we'll talk about that in a minute. Apologies for the water breaks. It's actually incredibly hot here in London, and it's quite dehydrating, to be honest. Okay, so let's go to Subandham. Okay, so this is the most important part of understanding what's going on in a sentence, right? So we have broken it down, understood what's the structure of what's the verb, right? And then we need to know what's the subject. Okay? So there are different cases, right? So you have Prathama Vibhakti, right? Now, Prathama Vibhakti is the karta, right? In terms of the Vibhakti maps to your Karaka, right? So you can take Prathama Vibhakti and it's mapped to the Karaka. Karaka is the subject. Like, so Ramaha does, Rama goes, right? So Ramaha Gachati, right? Ramaha is the subject, right? So now you have the karta there. Then in Dvitiya Vibhakti, it's accusative, right? He goes to the Ramaha Gam Rakshati, right? So here there's an object, that the subject operates on. That's the karma, right? So you have accusative, that's a Dvitiya Vibhakti, and then you have the object to which it goes. Right. So that is something, based on that, it will change the form. We'll see about the change in the form, right, shortly. Then you have the Tritiya Vibhakti, which is the instrumental case, which is the Karanam, right? So typically you would use, right, goes to, in English, right, Ramaha goes to village, by, it will be in the Tritiya Vibhakti. Whereas if you use by, with, or through, then it is actually the Tritiya Vibhakti. Yeah. So here you kind of go with Ramene, Ramabhyam, Ramehi, and so on. Right? We'll come to that part and how do you really, unwrap the original word from this. Right? Then you have the Chaturthi Vibhakti. Here, it's the dative case, right? Here, you have Sampradhanam. In Chaturthi, you have 2 4, right? So this could sometimes confuses with the Dvitiya Vibhakti, because in English, the way we would do it is with 2 or this thing, right? But that could also be 2 here. But here, something is given and somebody is actually receiving that. So there must be some transfer of something. It's not like just going to, right? So that's the Sampradhanam. Right? So, for Rama, so I am doing this for Rama, right? Then you say it's Ramaya, right? So then you have the receiver here is Rama. So that is where it is more of a for rather than to, right? Case. Whereas if it's to, it's an object. Then you have the Panchami, with which is the ablative case in English. Right? So it's a case of separation, upadam, right? See, Ramat, or Vrikshat, etc. It's essentially an ablative clause. So from Rama, something is this thing. So it's the opposite of, the Chaturthi, not exactly opposite, but it's kind of a different case, right? So you understand that it has to be from, so you have a separation of structure of the form here. Then you have Shashti, right, which is which is the genitive case, right? And here, in terms of karaka, it is sambandha karaka. We're talking about possession, right? So Ramasya, of Rama. So you have that Ramasya Patni Sita. It's like Asya is like a possessive case, and that's a sambandha. This thing. So it is establishing a connection and a sense of ownership, right? Of two entities. Right? Then you have Saptami, which is location, right? Locative case, and it's Adhikarana. It's the base on which something is happening, right? In Rama, right? Or in city, right? Nagare and all that. So you have that base on which it's happened. Right? Then you have Sambodhana, right? Which is vocative, and it is the karakam called Sambodhana, right? So where you address, right? You say, hey Rama, etc. Right? So you're actually addressing the person. So what happens with the Subandham is that these forms change based on, the word, right? So you have, like for Rama, you can see Ramaha, Ramu, and Ramaha. And you can see some patterns here, right? For example, while, these are like common, like Rama, Bhyam, etc. is different. You can look at Rama, Ramebhyaha is appearing in some of these dative and ablative cases, right? Chaturthi and Panchami Vibhakti. So in Rameshu is like in the plural. So you will see this occurring, right? Of course, this is not fixed. There are a number of such endings, but these endings follow certain patterns. And there are rules for how these endings are formed. And we have to study that to understand whether those have been declined correctly. But what we can do is look at these and understand what case it is in and which vibhakti it is in. And then we go back to Shabda Manjari. I think most of most of the students start memorizing the different declension forms for different endings, like Ajanta, Halanta, and so on. So I think it's a very useful exercise because that actually speeds up our ability to construct sentences and also unwrap. But for purpose of reading, we don't need to actually fully memorize it. As we encounter these declension patterns, we can actually understand what's going on and unwrap this and go back. Okay? So this basically tells us how the nouns or subandham or kind of decline, right? It's less complicated compared to the Tigantam in terms of how it's declined, but it's more in number because of the number of endings. Like Ajanta is all vowels, Halanta is all nouns, and then there is this gender-based differences. Then numbers like Sankhyas have a different declensions, and there are special cases of declension which seem to be outside certain rules. And we need to learn all of those declension types for us to be able to, understand, which case and karaka is coming in. But what we can do is to look at the word, get ourselves familiarized with that, go back to mapping it to these forms, and over a period of time, we'll develop that intuition for where it's coming from. Okay. And it's in a way, hopefully, it's probably more efficient because you don't actually use many of the declension forms, though they exist. You use a very small subset of that, and that occurs in the text that we want to study. I think once you got this, then we pretty much cover, this thing of the sentence, right? We are able to now read. We're able to break the sentences down into words. We are able to identify the verbs, and we are able to identify the nouns and see which form it is in. The next thing that we need to do is the Vritti Nirupan. And in this one, you have different types of pratyas that get added, right, to the words to form different endpoints. Now, these pratyas, we have to get used to, but most common vritti is the samasa vritti. And that is what actually adds to, makes the language appear complex, and also makes language complex, and also it's what adds the color to that language. So there are different types of samasas that we should familiarize ourselves with. Okay. Like you have the tatpurusha samasa, karmadharya, bahuvrihi, and all that, right? And interestingly, each one of these samasas, the name itself is an example of it. Like tatpurusha is an example of the word tatpurusha is an example of a tatpurusha samasa. Karmadharya is an example of that. Bahuvrihi is an example of bahuvrihi samasa, and so on. Right? So dvihu is where you have, two this thing getting added. Right? We already saw aveyi bhava samasa, right? Upanakaram and so on. Then you have dvandva, which is an example of the dvandva samasa. Right? So what the numbers indicate is they combine with, for example, tatpurusha combines with the cases, right? And then you get different variations of this. Then you have bahuvrihi appearing in different forms, like whether it's coming in as a adjective or or not, and so on. So you have those variations that come in. Okay. What we don't, eventually, there are courses to kind of go through some of these samasas itself, right? But for us to start reading text, we don't need to break it down into each one of these parts, right? And we don't need to understand this thing, because that would be laborious and it doesn't actually add. What we really need to do is to understand examples of these samasas, right?
Rajaram ji, sorry
Yeah.
for the interruption. We have just some 5-6 minutes left. So, yeah, request you.
Okay, let me quickly wrap it up. Is it?
Yeah, so that we can take some questions, 2 or 3 questions.
Sure, no worries. Okay. So, if you look at the samasas, you have, so tapasa adhyayana, then, this is an example of tatpurusha samasa, right? Then you have karmadharaya, right? You have, you go through that, so I will leave it in the interest of time, right? So like, bahuvrihi satyam vakyam yasasaha. So you kind of combine that, right? So you form a bahuvrihi samasa. Then you have the dvihu samasa, right? It's like dashavarsham, right? You kind of, you add, the number to this, and you get this version to this thing, right? So all of these start occurring, right? So when we read the text, when we see the samasa, we need to try and map it back to one of this, right? And I think for this, probably we need to work with some of the scholars to, who can help you do that mapping, right? And go through some of these courses to see this, right? And most of the samasas also have dictionary entries, so we should be able to understand what does joint of words mean. And especially in the case of Valmiki Ramayana, it's been translated word for word. It's available online, and it's the same case with text like Bhagavatam. Okay. So it will help us to map it back to the structure. I like to actually, spend a few minutes on this one, because this is very important. So what we did so far is like actually, kind of presenting a very simple structure of the language in terms of using, so commonly used terms like, verbs, nouns, etc., to understand the structure and how to quickly enter into reading. While it's enough for us to enter into it and work on it ourselves, it will also be important for us to understand the sutras, because the beauty of Sanskrit grammar is that it has been defined in terms of sutras. So I wanted to spend a few minutes on this very quickly to give a sense of, the beauty and power which they have defined this grammar. So we all have to take it, it's what. So basically, like, it's how they define Varnamala. If you see any other language, they'll give you a long list of, letters, right? And ask you to read it. That's not how Sanskrit does it, right? So it starts with what's called as the Maheshwara Sutani. The legend is that Maheshwara gave it to Panini, right? So, and, you have this sutra etc. And it goes all the way up to this. Then you have a sutra called Halantyam. Right? What Halantyam does is it basically says that Hal, the word Hal, is an it, or it's a null word, a null letter. It has got no meaning, right? So now basically it says in this sutras, Hal is an it. Okay, and then Upadesha, in the Upadeshas, right? Upadesha is a technical term within grammar, and within this Upadesha, it means it's a null, right? So why is that useful? If you take the next sutra, it tells you that, like Adirantyena Saheta, right? It basically says that from the beginning to the end, you take the letters and you combine them. Like we talked about, sandhis which are applicable to yan, right? So, how do we get those things? Is like through those roots, right? For example, one of the combination is an. You see, like, if there's a rule which is applying to an, or we talked about ajanta, right? So you take a to ich, right? This is, when you say ach, it defines, all the vowels. Then you say hal, it takes from ha to il, and then it defines all the consonants. Like that, you have different, terms that you're able to form, pratyaharas, which give you the group of letters. And once you define the group of letter, then you are able to apply the rules on those group of letters. That's how, they define this one, right? And you will see how they also further define, the structure of the language. Like, for example, like, for example, basically, you say Upadesha Aj Anunasika Hait. Like in Upadesha, the term, if Aj, the vowel is Anunasika, it's a nasal sound, it's an it. Right? So you define that. Like, for example, right, Lan, in Lan, that A is actually Anunasika, right? So it becomes it. What it does is Ran now becomes Ra, because in this one, right, Ran becomes Ra, right? Because in A becomes Anunasika. So Ra also becomes Ra, right? So it's able to form that structure. Then we in other languages we say, in other languages we have to go and define, the different this thing, right? Like short, long vowel and all that. Here, so they don't do that. Like they define, Hrasva, Dirgha, and Prataha. Like it comes in the 1 matra, 2 matra, and 3 matras, right? Which means it can apply to these different, letters, right? So you can appear in 1 matra, this thing is a, and so on, and then a, right? Krishna, and all, you kind of call this somebody in a distance, right? Which can appear. Then Uchcharanudata. Here you take, Niche Udata. So here they are defining the swara that applies to the text. Like I said, it appears mostly in the Vedas, so we don't need to worry about it for reading, Laukika text. But actually, the grammar is defined for both commonly, and it actually applies to that swara. So that's useful. Then Mukhanasika, Nasika, right? Ajanunasika. So when it is what is Anunasika is defined. Right? So what's the use of this is that you will be able to define, different types of swaras, right? And you are able to combine with this different vowels and their combinations, and in their long form, short form, and so on. And you end up with, we have very few sutras, like 4 or 5. You have now listed, the number, then list of vowels and consonants, and you also created lakhs of letters that you can form with these basic ingredients. And then you have also different ways of pronouncing it, and that's given as Tulyasa Prayatnam Sarnam, which part of your body that is pronounced, and then whether the pronunciation effort is internal or bahya. And for that one, what are the types of this thing, like whether it is Prayatnam is Sprishta, Sprishta, etc. So of course, this we have to learn from a guru to understand how exactly it's to be pronounced. But you see that with a few sutras, the entire Varnamala is capture. And we are able to this thing, and this is exactly how each one of the grammatical rules for Sandhi, etc., is captured. And I strongly recommend, going through Shastrigal's lectures on Sandhi. If you search for Abhinav Vyakarna on Google, on YouTube, you will find them, and that will give a sense of how these rules are, defined, and this thing, right? So that's the thing. I hope I have been able to, with my limited knowledge, been able to communicate, some aspects of the Sanskrit language, and hope I inspired you into understanding the structure of the language. I'll take a pause here, and if there's time, we can take questions, and I'll try my best to answer it.
Thank you, Rajaramji, for the wonderful presentation. I think many of the audience may need to go over this lecture again and again to fully understand and have more thought on it. Unfortunately, we are all out of time, so I'll just quickly, I want to ask one question, and that many people have requested, is to share the link to this document. Can you please share a link in the chat box so that everybody can access it? Yeah.
Sure. I don't have the link right away. I will send the link. It's there on my Facebook page. I'll share the link to you, and if it's possible to post it to all the audience.
Yeah. Okay. No, you can post it in the chat box if you can.
I don't have the link handy with me.
So. Is it? Okay. Okay. So
I will send it to you, and I think it can be shared with the people in the.
Yes, interested people can email us to Advaita Academy, and we will share the link with you. So just one or two questions I'll just see and take it up. One of the questions is Asmi and Asmi are both declined as Dhatu. How can they be Avyayas?
Okay.
This is a question in Q&A box. You can just have a look if you want.
So Adya appears in that form, and it's Avyaya because it does not change structure because of the structure of the form tense or lakara of the other thing, right? It's always this. So Avyaya essentially by definition is a word which do not change form because of the other words, right? Whereas the declinable words are words which will change form, right? So that's the reason why it's Avyaya.
I think many other questions are there. I think those interested can write to us those questions, and I will pass it on to Rajaramji, and he can respond to you on email directly.
Yeah.
So I think that is the best way forward, because I see many technical questions and we do not have time to address them. But hopefully this I'm sure that this whole session was very useful to many seekers, many new beginners of Sanskrit studies. And on the behalf of entire Advaita Academy and all of viewers, I thank you, Rajaramji, for making time to make this document first of all, and then of course for giving this lecture today. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Viewers, you can write to us. You can go to our website. We'll have our email ID. You can contact us, and we will forward you. We'll connect you to Rajaramji. And do follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram to get regular updates about the programs that we do and the videos that we upload. In fact, on our YouTube channel, we have Sanskrit teaching classes. We have more than 1,000 videos teaching Sanskrit. You can freely access them and learn Sanskrit in a systematic way. Do check it out. With this, we conclude this session. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha.